Hello everybody, welcome to episode 23 of Show For You, where today we will be going over William Shakespeare's play, Henry VI, Part 1. Now, this is actually my first foray into Shakespeare's histories, because previously I've only read his comedies and his tragedies. With his comedies, I'm not really a big fan of them. I've read As You Like It, A Midsummer's Night's Dream, stuff like that. I believe I've read 11 of his plays so far, so King Henry VI will be the 12th. And, yeah, I do prefer tragedies, and I just really do. I've really become to like Shakespeare as a writer. I mean, I have this whole beautiful anthology here. $40 only, by the way. Not even 40, $30. This beautiful tome. Absolutely lovely book. But yeah, so this book right here is kind of how this is how I read Henry VI, because it has everything in here. It has sonnets, poems, plays, everything. And but yeah, I wanted to check out one of his histories because I mean I'm a massive lover of history, and so I was like, you know what? I wonder if I like the dramatization of these events, and I ultimately end up doing so. Now, why I like to read Shakespeare is because I believe it is important to read these classical works of literature, because they give an insight to how far we've come, but it also gives an insight to how good the past writers were. Because like Shakespeare, though it is not of like the grandeur as if they like it's no Lord of the Rings or Dune or anything like that, but it's still a really good play, and it's not meant to be those. It's meant to entertain people and just simply be fun, be interesting, be fun, be dramatic. And Henry VI was. So we really start off with the death of Henry V. We don't actually see the death, but we're kind of at his funeral, and they're discussing him. They're like, oh, glazing Henry V. But then we progress along, and we eventually are in France, and we see Charles, who eventually becomes king, and he meets up with Joan La Pucelle. And this is just, I believe, Joan of Arc. I haven't researched it, but I do believe this is just Joan of Arc. But that's what she was called at the time, because I believe Joan of Arc is actually a relatively newer name, if I'm correct. I might be stupid and be misremembering. But yeah, so we meet Joan La Pucelle. I'm just going to call her Pucelle from now on. No, I should just call her Joan. But we meet up Joan, and she claimed to be a battle maiden and all that, and Charles is like, bro, face me. And they duel it out, and she wins, and she gains his respect from there. And so eventually they move along to the battle at Orleans, where Pucelle or Joan is able to win the day, and they end up taking back Orleans from the English. Because this story takes place during the 100 Years' War, actually 116 years, since 1337 to 1453, but goes on during this time period, and I believe I want to say 1416. It's in the early 1400s, because I believe, like I said, sometime around that was when Joan of Arc was executed, because I know it wasn't, I believe it was 1400s or 1410s when she was executed, or burned at the stake. Yeah, so it's around that time period, and it's going over the events of the 100 Years' War and its later portions. And so we see that, and then eventually we are introduced to the character of Talbot. Talbot is a just absolute beast of a warrior. He has been raiding the French and obliterating them, knocking them back. So he is one of the people that they are looking to take out. Charles Alencon, or Alencon. I'm not French, so I don't know exactly how to pronounce the name of that duchy. But, yeah, and Charles. So they're all trying to wipe out Talbot. And so we progress along, and we end up seeing as King Henry VI, because King Henry VI, we see him come to power, and we see as his ministers, well, not really ministers, but two of his higher ups. So we have Gloucester, who is who's his uncle, and we have Winchester, who is a member of the church, who eventually becomes a cardinal. And now we see them debate, and they're like, oh, you're trying to take the power away from Henry. And then eventually they end up settling the debate, and Henry kind of mediates it. But then we end up seeing the Battle of Rouen, Rouen. It's probably got some French tang to it, but I don't know. Like I said, I'm not French. But yeah, we end up seeing the Battle of Rouen. We see as Talbot is beat out of the city, but then he retakes the city eventually, and that's kind of because Joan and them are coming and they're trying to fight and all that good stuff. But yeah, then after that, we end up moving along, and we see as Henry VI is coronated in Paris. And then, once again, we move further along, and we get to a battle. I have to find it here, because I don't remember the exact name of the battle, but, Bedford, same. Where's it at? Yeah, guys, I remembered Rowan and Orleans, but Hall State. Gotta look at all these acts. Bordeaux. So Bordeaux is the location of the final battle in this book. And in Bordeaux, we're introduced to, well, in this little arc area, we're introduced to John Talbot. And John Talbot is Big Talbot's son. And there you have a scene together, I believe it's like scene 2 or something, of, I believe Act 3, let me check. There. Talbot. Yeah, we briefly see as Talbot before the Battle of Bordeaux. We end up seeing Talbot interact with the king because he's talking about it. And Henry's like, yo, you're the dude who's been fighting back the French for me. So he just kind of gives him some recognition there. But, yeah. Then, let me find where it's at again. Not too far. Talbot. John. Paris, that's after them. Charles Alicon. Talbot. Where are you, Talbot, bro? I can't find him. Oh, golly. King Henry. Duchess. And we briefly see throughout this whole thing as Talbot kind of interacts. Well, we into Rowan. We see as Talbot interacts with the nobility of the town that he is sacked. How far in is this? Act 4. Whitmore, no. I'm in the... Well, it's somewhere in there. I'm not looking for it, but yeah, sorry about that brief intercession. But yeah, they have a brief conversion between Talbot and his son, and then tragically at the Battle of Bordeaux, John Talbot is saved, but then he's killed. And it is a very tragic scene because honestly, just that brief time John was there and him and Talbot talked, it was honestly kind of grasping. Like, that shows that even in the brevity of this 33-page play, that they can build really good character. And it just kind of reminds me of Monster, which I've watched previously. But, yeah, we see that, and eventually we see as Suffolk, who is one of King Henry VI's ministers, he's going to look for Henry a wife. And he ends up finding a wife in the daughter of the King of Naples. Her name is Margaret, and he's kind of worried because she doesn't really have much distinction because the King of Naples isn't too distinguished when it comes to actual, like, titles. And so he ends up taking the idea back to Henry, and then we get to that at the end of the book. But yeah, at the Battle of Bordeaux, we see some fighting, but Joan is ultimately captured. Now, okay, yeah, one thing I forgot to mention before the Battle of Bordeaux was that the Duke of Burgundy, who was one of King Henry's loyalists, actually turns traitor and leads to a harder battle at Bordeaux. And that's why we see Talbot die and all that. Now, after the Battle of Bordeaux, we end up seeing as the army of the Duke of York ends up coming in and kind of dealing with everything. Ends up taking Joan hostage and all that. And so then we progress along, and the story kind of ends in the Act 5, Scene 4. We predominantly see as Joan is being kind of put on trial in a way, but she's not on trial. They're just kind of discussing what she's done, and she mentions how she's with child from Alencon and all of that. But we don't actually end up seeing her getting burned at the stake in this play. But yeah, so we know what happened since we know what happened in history. But yeah, that progresses along, and then in the final scene, we end up seeing as King Henry VI is introduced to, well, he's not introduced, but he's introduced to the idea of marrying Margaret, and Gloucester's like, I don't know if I want to do this because she's not really distinguished enough. And Suffolk's like, well, Henry should not want to marry her because of him being distinguished because of her. He should be wanting to marry her because of love and all that. And Suffolk ends up pressing that, and then at the end he's like, yes, now I'll have control of the king and the queen and the realm. So, yep, that is kind of where that ends. It kind of ends on a weird spot. I was kind of hoping that it would end with the burning of Joan at the stake, because that would have been a pretty climactic ending. But I mean, it leads into the second play pretty well. because I haven't read it yet, but I know it starts off kind of with the marriage and all that going on. But yeah, that was King Henry VI Part 1. It was a really enjoyable play. I liked it. It only took me like 2 hours to read in total. But yeah, it was really good. And for the first history that I've read by William Shakespeare, it was very solid. I'm most certainly going to be reading more of them. And I'll most certainly read the whole saga of King Henry VI in this, because it's got all of them. So yeah, if you want to get into Shakespeare, I would highly recommend this book. It is the Complete Works, whatever brand that is. But yeah, beautiful book. I highly recommend. Would highly recommend Henry VI because it was really good. But yeah, that is all for episode 23 of Shelf Review. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.